Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the AIDS United Google Hangout series, We Shall Not Be Removed, the state of HIV and Black, gay, and bisexual communities. My name is Yolo Akili Robinson, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We Shall Not Be Removed is the first in a four-part Google Hangout series dedicated to examining critical issues as it relates to Black gay men. Throughout this series, we'll be examining several different issues, such as power and leadership in HIV and AIDS organizations, the realities of condomless sex and desire, as well as the disproportionate rates of infection in gay and bisexual Black communities. The series is brought to you by AIDS United, a national organization dedicated to ending the HIV and AIDS epidemic in the United States through strategic grant making, capacity building assistance, and formative research. Our first Google Hangout series, which is today, is held on a very special day to me and as well to some of the participants of the panel, and that is the birthday of Marlon Riggs. For those of you who do not know, Marlon Riggs is a esteemed, brilliant documentary filmmaker who produced numerous films that explored African American life along the lines of race, gender, sexuality, and class. Some of the films that he was well known for include Tongues Untied, Affirmations, Color Adjustment, Black Is, Black Ain't, and many, many more. I know for myself, many of those documentaries really brought me into a certain kind of political understanding as a Black gay man, and had an influence on a generation of Black gay men before me as well. Joining me today to explore Marlon Riggs' legacy and how his legacy impacts this current moment or influences this particular political moment is, of course, an esteemed panel of gentlemen I have with me. Many of them colleagues I've known for a very long time, to be a part of this dynamic conversation. First off, we have Kenyon Farrow. Kenyon Farrow is the U.S. Global Policy and Health Policy Director at Treatment Action Group. Kenyon will be joining us out of Washington, D.C. Next, we have Charles Stevens. Charles Stevens is the founder of the Counter Narrative Project, which is a product initiative that seeks to amplify the voices of Black gay men. And last but not least, we have Aquarius Gilmer, who is the regional affiliate coordinator of the National Black Leadership Commission on AIDS. All of the full bios of our participants are available online at the AIDS United /Google Hangout, so you can learn much more. Of course, these men have done a lot more dynamic work than I can summarize in just that one sentence. So definitely check them out, check out the work that they're doing, and you'll learn more about them as we continue the conversation today. Also, if you're watching out there, and you may have some questions you want to ask our participants, you have an opportunity in the way in which we've created this hangout. So, for instance, if you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag #WeShallNotBeRemoved. And if you use that Twitter hashtag, if you have a question or a comment or something that you're thinking as the panelists and participants are going through the conversation, submit that with that hashtag, and what will happen is that we will take some of those questions and actually use them to engage our panelists at the later half of this presentation today. All right? So once again, this is interactive. Make sure you're engaging us. And also you can follow us on Twitter at AIDS United as well to find out more information about this program and other programs that we'll be having in the future. All right? So with that being said, let's transition into our conversation. I think we have a lot of space to cover. All right. So the first question I want to ask for our participants is, again, going back to the main theme of today's panel, which is talking about Marlon Riggs' work and how his work influenced our lives. Today is his birthday. He will be 54 years old today. And I just want to get a sense from a participant. Tell me a little bit about how Marlon Riggs influenced your life. What was your first time engaging his work? What did his work mean to you? And just getting a general sense of your first encounter with Marlon's work. And I think Kenyon, would you mind answering that question?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I have maybe an unusual story about engaging Marlon Riggs' work for the first time. When I was about, I think about 14 years old, I'm living in Cleveland, Ohio, and my mother, was an activist in her youth in her own right. And one of the things she used to always make us do was watch every, kind of PBS documentary, Eyes on the Prize, How the West Was Lost, anything sort of political that she thought, was important for us to know, in terms of history. When Tongues Untied was going to air on PBS, I want to say it was around 1989, 1990. Became a huge national story because the senator from North Carolina at the time, Jesse Helms, used the film, to sort of talk about, it was, sort of disgusting and kind of morally debased, and that public taxpayer dollars shouldn't be supporting this kind of work. And so he used it on the floor of Congress to try to make an argument for defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or PBS. And, my mother felt it was important, therefore, to support the film. A lot of local PBS stations around the country pulled the film so that it wouldn't be shown. And so, so when I was about 14, we watched, this amazing documentary about, the lives of Black gay men, in the late 1980s. And I think one of the ways that it was important to me was, I had a kind of a family that was very, involved in politics and politically active in certain ways. And we also knew, there were gay people, lesbians, in my community who were friends of the family or whatever. But this particular film gave me a vision for my life, particularly as a Black gay man who also was, an artist and interested in politics and writing. It really gave me a vision for what my life and work could really be like, bringing all those things together. And so the film, that Tongues Untied in particular was important to me to see at 14, and really shaped everything I would do after that.
Wow, amazing. Thank you for sharing. Charles, tell us a little bit more about your experience with Marlon Riggs' work.
For me, Marlon Riggs changed everything. Seeing Tongues Untied, I believe I was in college, provided such an incredible lens to view myself, to view my world. It helped clarify my politics. It helped me see myself as a Black gay man where I didn't have to rank or privilege or prioritize my identities. It was also a part of the community of Black gay men I came out into. That was one of the gifts they provided. I believe I was a freshman at Morehouse College at the time and was looking for community and looking for a sense of myself. And I met this extraordinary community of Black gay men, and also Black queer women, certainly, but also Black gay men that taught me about Tongues Untied and Black Is, Black Ain't, and Marlon Riggs, and really the legacy of the Black gay Renaissance, what the scholar Charles Nero calls the 1986 generation, this very extraordinary generation of Black gay men, Marlon Riggs certainly being one of them, that put forth a vision of Blackness that completely disrupted and challenged these essentialized notions of race and gender and sexuality even before the category of queerness. So for me, again, it really changed everything. It changed my life. It transformed me, and it gave me, in many ways, the tools to begin my own work.
Wow, very powerful. It's interesting. Just like I kind of shared with my piece, Marlon Riggs has had a lot of influence on both of your lives. Thinking specifically about this current political moment that we're in, what do you see? Can you naming one theme that you see in Marlon Riggs' work? Because there's lots of themes, right? What is one thing that you can kind of connect to the current political moment that we're in? And when I say the current political moment, I'm talking about looking at Black gay communities in the current state that we're in, not just like in terms of speaking specifically to HIV, but speaking also to like the emotional state, the broader kind of cultural moment that we live in. How do you see Marlon Riggs' works influencing that, or what themes do you see that are present and connected to that? And either of you could answer, lead with this one.
Well, I definitely think that one of the gifts he brought was putting the interior lives of Black gay men front and center in a way that I don't see there being much curiosity about now. Looking at the research landscape, looking at the policy landscape, even looking at the programmatic landscape, there's an interest in Black gay men certainly as, I think, the recipient of extensive structural violence, which is a reality. You know, there's an interest in Black gay and bisexual men from a clinical perspective, right? But none of these strategies really get at the interior lives of Black gay men, and certainly Black gay and bisexual men. They don't get at trauma. They don't get at our sexual subjectivities. They don't get at, there's just not an interest. And I feel like that fails us. Another gift that Marlon Riggs' work brings that we can look to as we develop our own programmatic research and policy practices moving forward is this absolute interest in not ranking oppressions, not ranking identities. We use we use words like intersectionality, particularly the HIV field, but we have no sense of the genealogy of that concept. We don't talk about Audre Lorde and the Master's Tools will never dismantle the Master's House. We don't talk about Marlon Riggs in Tongues Untied and how he said that choosing between his blackness and his gayness was like choosing between his left eye and his right eye. We barely talk about Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. So I feel like there needs to be, in the realm of ideas and in the realm of advocacy, a greater appreciation for the context that gave rise to these particular ideas that we use. And finally, I think we've been absolutely impoverished by the lack of feminist analysis in Black, gay, and bisexual men's HIV advocacy. And so when we look at what made Black, gay men's HIV advocacy possible, it made the activism possible, it was absolutely Black feminism. Like all of those men, including Marlon Riggs, was very much influenced by feminism, very much influenced, and you see it is definitely exemplary in his work, Black Is, Black Ain't, right, where he has Bell Hooks and Angela Davis and so forth. And I think it does us a disservice because, certainly Black, gay, and bisexual men are pitted against Black women in this sort of race to the bottom, around like funding, like we're pitted against each other, we all lose. And I think that part of that is, again, a lack of feminist analysis that Black, gay, bisexual men, not to say some of us do, like certainly some of us do, Yolo certainly, but I think that it should be more proliferated in the landscape.
Yeah, I would say too that I think that one of the things that I think Marlon Riggs' body of work offers, I think, to this particular moment, I think a little maybe outside of specifically the HIV landscape, but I'm thinking about this kind of moment of a kind of lot of Black community mobilization, under a lot of it under this sort of like Black Lives Matter kind of brand, for lack of a better word. And and even though that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the work right now is very focused on kind of police violence, or even kind of like violence by non-Black people against Black people, like in the case of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. So we're seeing a lot of the kind of work focused on those particular issues. But I think as we're also seeing some of the folks who are part of that work, some of whom are Black LGBT folks who are leading that work, or who are a part of it, and who are I think beginning to sort of think about, okay, so what does like Black Lives Matter mean beyond just thinking about the sort of prison and policing apparatus. I mean, I think there's no way, like Black Is, Black Ain't, to me, as a film, kind of speaks to all of that, right? From what the film was finished or premiered around in the early mid '90s, right before Marlon passed, or right after Marlon passed. He died in the making of it, which you see if you haven't seen it. But but that film really gets, I mean, it could have been called Black Lives Matter, right, if you really think about it, because it really looks at what it means to be Black, in the United States, and in themes that are still very, very relevant in terms of what kind of looking at kind of region of the country that folks are from, looking at the kind of differing cultural phenomena, looking at kind of gender and sexuality, looking at like both kind of like white, like sort of racism, and also inner Black community politics around gender and sexuality and class and those things. And so I think his body of work, but I think specifically that film offers a lot. And I think specifically because the film also deals with the reality of unfortunately his dying body in that moment. And I think we have a lot of HIV activism has been very separated from other kinds of social justice sort of work. Some of it that I think is about the HIV community, and some of it I think is actually about some issues in the Black community of like actually being able to engage around HIV from thinking about it beyond certain kind. There's still a lot of kind of silence and heavy stigma that exists. So I think that film to me is a particular way in which I think that his work is very relevant in the current moment.
Absolutely. It's interesting. Kenyon, you brought in the situation talking about the focus that we have currently, like that's brought on by Ferguson and recent events around policing and Black Lives Matter. I was actually a part of a conversation that kind of was divided into two camps, where there were individuals who were talking about direct parallels or direct links between what's happening, of course, with the policing and what happened with Ferguson and the activism around that, and the ways in which Black lives, Black gay lives, or Black MSM lives were valued within the context of the HIV and AIDS organizations, or within the context of this movement, HIV and AIDS movement. And there was a lot of there was definitely two different sides. One side arguing that there definitely was a lot of connections, like a strong and direct connection between the devalue on Black male life and the particular ways in which the industry engages us, and then people saying that there were no parallels and no connections at all. And so I'd be very curious to hear from you all, thinking about current events. Do you see any connections between, like, the policing and, like, HIV and AIDS and Black MSM, or do you not do? How do you perceive that in terms of the current political moment?
Well, I think that we can trace much of our movement history to Black gay and bisexual men that launched an absolute critique of the state and state violence in the 1980s. I mean, certainly groups like ACT UP, very well. He did great work, and I think they're representative of a certain kind of confrontational resistance and also a critique of power. But there are also Black gay men that were very much engaged in the 1980s around a critique of the state, and I will also put Marlon Riggs in that. So that's where we can absolutely trace some of our own movement history. Like, we come from that heritage of Black gay men that were not only critical of the state, but also seen as threats of the state. So you have, for example, Pat Buchanan in the 1992 Republican presidential primaries using Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied to critique George H.W. Bush, the first George H.W. Bush, as using Tongues Untied to critique funding for the arts, right? Because it was a threat. Marlon Riggs was threatening. So, and I really want us today to consider, how do we build upon that history? How do we build upon our that lineage that we come from to better understand? And I really think I want to also lift up how resources come to Black gay men's activism in communities. There has been, in many ways, I believe, more of an investment in a certain kind of bureaucratic programmatic leadership rather than an investment in movement leadership, which is why the advocacy landscape is so impoverished in many ways for Black and bisexual men. Not that people aren't doing work, people are doing work, but it's hard to build power when the resources and investment goes to large bureaucracies and not to community-driven solutions. And that critique can be made, of course, across the nonprofit and HIV across the board. But I really believe that moving forward, we have to absolutely engage funders to really consider investing not only in large bureaucracy, large organizations, and not to say that they shouldn't be funded, because certainly that investment is important too, but what I'm saying is that that shouldn't be the only investment. There should also be investment in community-driven solutions. There should be investments in community-driven coalitions, but really a consideration of how we can cultivate and inspire movement leaders that can do real grassroots organizing, right? And not just electoral politics, not just around getting out, which is important, but also just around how do we mobilize Black gay men to save their lives. And I really think that's the starting point of this conversation.
Absolutely. Kenyon, I see you look like you got a thought cloud above your head.
Waving my church fan and everything else in Charleston.
Yes.
I think that absolutely, that when you really look at the landscape of what is being funded, and we see in a lot of the kind of history of Black gay organizations, prior in some ways to the kind of establishment of like the sort of AIDS Inc., right, as a particular sort of branch of nonprofit sort of work, that organizations were doing a lot of creative, both kind of cultural work, community organizing, coalition building, a range of things in that. As now the money to do various kinds of HIV prevention, a lot of it kind of prevention work through behavioral interventions or testing, because the money was so lopsided in that direction, it really then sucked the resources, so that organizations very much, their missions became driven by those things and not, as Charles said, about kind of saving Black gay men's lives more broadly. And so I think by the time we see a lot of that money really come down from CDC in like 1998, 1999, which I will note was too late, right? It was too late. almost 20 years in the epidemic for to start to see sort of money for MSM of color, reach, men of color even more broadly. But because of that, it definitely like sort of tipped the scale, and we didn't see the same kind of upscale in terms of private foundations that are more likely to fund advocacy, community organizing, leadership development, really support Black gay men's work in the field. And I think what we have now, I think, is a result of it. So we sort of have some kind of like pipeline sort of work that is, I think, supporting particular kinds of young Black gay men who are in bachelor's or moving into graduate programs, who want to specifically sort of work within the HIV either research or kind of policy landscape. But we have almost nothing that supports Black gay men to actually who are organizing in St. Louis, in New Orleans, in Atlanta, in name the city, who are really sort of building power locally that then can influence national politics, right? But from a local perspective.
Yeah, and what's unique, I mean, what I love about you, Kenyon, certainly, is that, your background is in anti-criminalization. Well, one of your, many talents, right? You worked with critical resistance and so forth, and that's really fabulous to also be able to work within these HIV spaces, too, because you bring that to bear, and certainly I, too, come from a more broad social justice perspective, having been the national youth organizer for the Black Radical Congress, and just having a much broader lens. So when I came into the HIV field, I was shocked, right, by like when I would raise certain kinds of political questions, that it was, it didn't always land the way I wanted it to land.
Right.
Kenyon, I thought that both of you brought up really great points. Kenyon, one of the pieces that I'm glad that you brought up in this conversation is giving us a context in terms of how we got to where we are. Because when we had this conversation a little bit, over coffee, pancakes, tea, all that good stuff. But the reality is that, like, when we talk about like the rates of infection in Black gay communities, oftentimes the discourse tends to be that, like, and I'm talking about in mainstream, outside of the bubble of the HIV and AIDS industry, the assumption is often that like the reason that our rates are so high is because Black gay men don't use condoms enough, or Black gay men are messy, or all these different kind of narratives. And when you frame it in that historical context by actually looking at and holding these institutions accountable for, like, the fact that, like, by the time that like Black MSM were targeted in the context of the epidemic, that like the numbers were already kind of growing and had reached a place, right? And so that's how we got to this current moment, as opposed to it being that kind of earlier narrative where it's just kind of like something, quote unquote, which kind of goes to this place of like saying something's wrong with us, as opposed to addressing the historical, political context of this, and how we got to this current moment. I think it's such an important piece to bring in and kind of to reinforce. And I know both of you have done a lot of great work in terms of pushing that out there and not allowing the other narratives to dominate. The next question I have, I think we kind of already gotten them to a little bit, and it was a question like, from your perspective, what unessential elements of the industry, and by industry I mean the HIV and AIDS industry, what are the things that what the industry is doing that is preventing us from most effectively doing our work to impact the lives of Black MSM? And Charles, I think you kind of addressed that earlier in terms of like thinking about like how does the industry actually relate to me as an individual, the internal life of myself, as opposed to being utilized for whatever other function. But I'd love to hear more of your thoughts around that piece.
Yeah.
Charles.
You go first.
All right. So I was trying to push it off on you. So you take that first. No. So I think to sort of maybe put a finer point on Charles's earlier point, I think that like we are in the situation now where within the kind of HIV prevention and treatment care landscape, advocacy landscape, there's a kind of a hyper focus really for the first time on Black gay men or Black MSM in a particular way, and in some ways that's good, right? Because I think having some like particular attention given the epi data makes sense. I think where I sort of have some challenges is how do we sort of create the kind of the attention, the focus, resources, thinking about kind of how, especially in this moment as the Affordable Care Act and these different lots of things are changing in terms of how people receive prevention or treatment or care. in many parts of the country. So it's important to focus on those things, I think, and see and to be asking questions about whether these things work or don't work currently in their current state for Black gay men. My challenge is that we not make that focus kind of another sort of stigmatizing project that sort of says the reason why we haven't ended this epidemic is because of you Black gay men, and now it's time for you to get your stuff together, right? And so I think that so there's to me a balance that I think that we need to strike, or a different kind of framework that is really about the sort of like being invested in the work at whatever vantage point we're doing it, from a community level, organizing, advocacy, sort of policy or service-based level. Any of these things is really about how are we valuing the lives of Black gay men and making these systems work for Black gay men, as opposed to it's time for you to get your stuff together so that we can all move on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I would add, like, I feel like in there, Charles, you also had a critique about class and what kind of Black gay men are we valuing, right? Are we valuing Black gay men who are able to kind of ascend into the, like, the laurels of, like, having a PhD or MPH, and we're just valuing them because they can work in a certain kind of particular context? Are we valuing Black gay men who are doing grassroots organizing, who don't speak the academic jargon, aren't able to go to all the big fancy conferences? Who are we actually valuing as in terms of Black gay men's lives? Charles, do you have any comments?
Well, I just want to go back to an earlier conversation we were having at a point that I didn't make that I really want to make. And that point is that most of the Black gay men I know and they're in my life, that are in my life, have been in jail at some point, have been engaged in the criminal system. And I feel like that I just never hear that, like the ways that Black gay men are vulnerable to mass incarceration and how that same vulnerability has implications for HIV. And I mean, I don't mean just like severely economically distressed. I mean, across the board, educationally, in terms of class, like different. And I just want to hold that up because I just feel like we need to have that conversation. But to get to the question you just asked about like unessential sort of elements, what I will offer is the myth that absolutely drives me crazy. I'm not going to say it's a myth, but I will say that one of the narratives that I hear a lot is around like what's considered a risk factor and what's considered a protective factor. And to be perfectly honest, anecdotally, like what I've seen in my work is that the things that we associated with risk factors for HIV vulnerability and the things that we associate with protective factors don't hold up in my life. Like most of the Black gay men I know in my life have HIV. Since I've started doing this work, even before, every year I lost someone in my life, to AIDS complications, like every year, including last year. Across the board economically, across the board in terms of the level of outness, in terms of like all the things we associate with protective factors. And I want to connect that also to how we talk about HIV in the South. I think that the poverty conversation as being a driver of HIV in the South is a valuable conversation to have. I think it's important. But I also think, unfortunately, it obscures the impact of HIV on Black gay men. And I think poverty doesn't always land the way we think it lands as a risk factor. Like, it's like poverty, South. And yes, that's true. But I also know Black gay men with PhDs that are also vulnerable to HIV and seroconvert. And they don't see themselves at risk, and they don't see themselves as vulnerable because you're not talking to me, right? And then when they seroconvert, there's this extra stigma related to the politics of respectability, so they feel like they can't come out because it's not supposed to happen to them, right? Which is why I think at a lot of AIDS service organizations, I've seen young Black gay men seroconvert in the field and not be in treatment because they can't. Like, what do you do with that? Like, how do you come out as having HIV and you are HIV prevention counselor or something, So I feel like there are all of these very complex ways and interactions that we have, and I think that some of the conversations actually obscure those very important facts, and I really want us to have that conversation too.
Yeah, one of the things, Charles, you said just made me think about that I really struggle with is the kind of way a lot of the both service provision and advocacy, I feel like, has kind of created the dynamics around positive versus negative,
the good gays and the bad gays.
Yeah, like also youth versus non-youth, and just some of it I think is and then poor and not poor, like these different things that actually, I think some of it is because, like, just as black people, like, we kind of, whatever, even in varying social economic, so having the PhD does not mean you won't get stopped by the cops, right? Like, it doesn't,
Absolutely.
like, you know what I mean? Like, so, like, those things still happen to us, so that the kind of impact of racism is still there, but also, just we're like a small community. So it's like, just because because you're the person with, the PhD or the MPH or whatever, like, your still dating pool is like, or men that you're having sex with still may be poor black gay men, right? Like these things don't necessarily like divide so easily, right? And I think, and so I think what we've done, unfortunately, is to kind of is not figured out ways. We've adopted some models that I think that don't necessarily serve us. Like, to be frank, I said this I think a couple months ago to y'all, that like, I don't know, like, I understand, like, the sort of AIDS activist kind of moment of like the Denver principles, which were kind of people with HIV at the forefront of all of the work, and I definitely like believe that, right? As an organizer, people most affected always leading the work. But in some ways, I think that is actually, for us, having HIV negative black gay men, or men presumed to be negative, to be able to be silent and absolved from kind of being engaged in the conversation and work, or even being able to talk about what it means, like for myself to be 40 and HIV negative. There's no space for me to talk about like what that's like, or what it's like now at 40, to try to be thinking about those things, right? So
Yeah.
I think we have to rethink like what is actually a way for us to kind of organize and do the work that makes sense for us and not make sense for, frankly, what some folks. So I'm probably gonna get some hate mail, but what made sense, when people, did that 30 years ago, right? What that conversation was, in Denver, may not make sense for us at this moment.
Well, and I think that part of why we're not able to have many of these conversations is the hard truth is that many of the HIV and LGBT organizations have failed black and bisexual men. They failed us. So the question becomes, how do we move forward? From that?
I apologize. I think we had enough cookies right there. Charles, did you want to say?
And what are the opportunities to really try to reform any of these institutions?
Right, or create new ones.
Excellent. Yeah.
All right. So this piece definitely brings us to everyone's ass, and given that call some friends, all said in the context of this, people feel self-converting and come to those points in those moments, like it's affected. We all have those moments, right? So what do you, as experts in the field, what are some things that you see as new to actually to lower the numbers of seroconversion in our community, to address them? What do you see as a strategy or a technique that we need to perform that's not currently present anymore?
Kenyon.
All right. Well, what I would say, I think that is happening now that to me is interesting. But I mean, there's several things. I do think whether or not I like all of it isn't the point, but I think that we are in a moment where there's a certain kind of visibility that black gay men have across the board in whether we're talking about the kind of pop culture and and then certainly in the kind of HIV landscape and black gay men running some even major institutions like Color of Change, right, or things like I think that there's a we are in a particular moment right now that I think that is important to sort of make note of in terms of like our sort of visibility, and that I think that that there is a kind of interest I do see in a kind of like younger black gay men who are really interested in trying to figure out how to sort of be in the work and in service to the community in different ways, right? I think those things are actually really, really great. And I think, so I guess I would just say that, like, you know, I think that I think there's a lot of things happening right now that are, we're kind of on the precipice, I think, of making some kind of connectors that I think really can then really sort of, I think, kind of advance the work in particular kind of ways. I think, like, the work Counter Narrative Project is doing is a part of that space.
I didn't pay him to say that.
Say what?
I didn't pay Kenyon to say that.
No, he didn't pay me, but no, it's true. I think there's that. I think there are also ways, even in terms of the HIV space, that, you know, the, you know, work that we're, you know, that I'm, you know, kind of doing at TAG and you know, with Counter Narrative and with AIDS United. The other, you know, there have been things that we've been doing that have been really collaborative and trying to sort of move, you know, move together and separately at the same time, right? That I think is really that I think is really important. And so I think we're just kind of beginning to see. I think we've seen a lot of things sort of pop up in the last couple of years, both, like I said, pop culture and also in the sort of kind of progressive kind of organizing or political advocacy space. But I think the connecting tissue is just beginning to sort of happen.
Yes, I just want to remind everyone, you're not speaking, because we had a little bit of feedback. So just make sure you're not speaking so we don't get any technological glitches there going back and forth. Charles, did you have anything to add to that point?
Yes. Okay. I would like, I think we need to do 3 things starting yesterday to really move the agenda forward. The first thing is, I absolutely think we need to have political education for Black, gay, and bisexual men and allies. I think that political education needs to look like advocacy skills building. How do you do legislative advocacy? How do you write action alerts? How do you do op-eds? How do you engage your elected officials? There needs to be political education. Also related to, like, issue awareness, right? So around HIV criminalization, around intersectionality, like those kinds of issues, and also movement history. So the first thing is we absolutely need political education across the board, and building on efforts that already exist. The second thing I think we need to do moving forward is really rethinking and reimagining our messaging. I think that our messaging, be it health communication, social marketing, should strive to speak to the hearts and minds of Black and bisexual men better, speak to our deepest desires, seek to inspire, seek to evoke emotions, and not just be sort of this banal, overly focused grouped, cliched kind of marketing. Like, we need to have messages that are more powerful, that are transformative, right? And that mean something, that are meaningful. The third thing that I want us to do moving forward is to again really rethink how we mobilize. I think there's been a lot of success mobilizing Black and bisexual men around HIV testing days and, you know, these HIV awareness days and things like that. But I really believe that culture is an important part of mobilization. I hosted a Tongues Untied screening last fall with George Equality, and it was like 90, 100 Black and bisexual men in the room to watch Tongues Untied, this 25-year-old film at the time, right? They were excited to see themselves. They were lifted. They were elevated. There was magic, and I really want to see that brought into how we mobilize Black and bisexual men. And I think that really that art and culture can do that and harness the power that exists among us. So again, political education, and messaging that's more authentic.
Yeah, I would add one quick thing. You gave that was like a good 3 points. I want to kind of encapsulate like one thing it made me think about. I think in terms of from a very the kind of HIV sort of healthcare, that sort of space. I think that one, work that is actually holding various sorts of infrastructures accountable for their lack of capacity in serving Black gay men, or even or doing anything around, I think that's one of the things I'm really interested in, kind of how do we mobilize folks at the grassroots, but also turn our attention to kind of institutional change, versus testing days, which becomes important, but it's a very individualized sort of effort versus like, why is it that like in some, you know, cities and states the funding is not there, so people are having to pay for STD screenings and pay for, you know, tests at like, you know, healthcare clinics, or why, you know, Medicaid has not expanded in the states it has expanded, right? Like, let's like advance agendas that actually point like the finger at institutions of power, and not just mobilize to sort of get people to do individual acts of like getting tested or, you know, so on and so forth. So those are like, I would just add as part of that mix.
Yeah, we absolutely need to build power, and I think that's definitely the starting point. What I would also offer is how we measure our impact. And what I hope is that we move beyond these narrow metrics to measure our impact and look more at the meaningful experiences we're able to create for Black, gay, and bisexual men, so that we're able to build power, so that they can advocate for Medicaid expansion in the South, so that they can hold these institutions accountable, and that that sort of work exists.
Absolutely. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge Aquarius Gilmer, who has been having technological difficulties, but has joined us. Welcome, Aquarius. We're glad we can get in here with us. Can you hear us, Aquarius? Oh, looks like he's speaking, but we can't see him.
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, there you are. Hey, hi, Aquarius. Hold on. What's going on? Okay, we're still having some technological difficulties because I can't hear Aquarius.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hey, yeah, technology isn't perfect, right? Lots of user error on this end. Thank you, Yolo. My apologies for being late. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we covered a lot of ground, Aquarius, and then before we actually get into the some of the questions I want to address in the audience, we have a lot of people who've tweeted and who are watching who have some questions I want to address. I just want to give you a minute or two to kind of weigh in, because I know you've been in and out of the conversation, so I'm sure you have some thoughts and ideas you want to share with us.
Yeah, so I think, you know, Marlon Riggs, for me, I was introduced to him not too long ago. Actually, I didn't overhear, Charles was talking about Marlon at a convening that we were both at, and I was like, who's this Marlon Riggs guy? And then I have since watched like Ethnic Notions and his other works like religiously, and I've been like spreading this gospel of Marlon Riggs, right? So much so that, like, you know, when I meet other gay Black men, I'm like, you know, Marlon Riggs, are like, no, and no one seems to know who this guy is. And so it's, you know, to life of the work in terms of like building power among Black gay men, I think, you know, sort of resurrecting who this guy is. I mean, and his impact in the Black gay male community is terribly important. And to the point of, you know, thinking about advocacy agendas and, you know, even power building and development, I think, you know, we need to begin to think about seeing images of ourselves in mainstream TV, like in like terms of like shaping the culture of our nation, because we don't really see a lot of Black gay men on HGTV or Logo, even in some of the other spaces where you see, you know, this dominant theme of white lesbians, white gay men, and they're able to live in their truths, and their narratives are able to be, you know, pretty well depicted. But what we see in a lot of, I think, some Black gay male images are the extremes, right? We don't see a lot of the life as it is for Black gay men, and I hope that, you know, there will be opportunities for folks to think about, those who have the pocketbooks and funding streams, to think about how do we begin to really shape the shed light on this powerful community, which shapes a lot of culture within the Black community, and even by extension the American community society. So that's my 2 cents without having heard all this good stuff that's come out so far from this conversation.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. I'm glad we can get you in. So, so what I want to go to now is we actually have a couple of questions from the audience, people who have been tweeting, who have some things they want to ask us. I'm going to share them as they're sent to me, and I'll offer you all an opportunity to choose who would like to answer them. The first question I have here is, What is the state of Black leadership at HRC and other national LGBT and AIDS organizations? And that is the question. And so I guess it's getting a sense of what's the state of that leadership. And anyone who's that question.
I'll take that. I guess I guess I just don't care, right? I am past the point, you know, of having, you know, a range of kind of critiques of, you know, human rights campaign or a number of other these sort of mainstream equality organizations and what their kind of agendas are. I just maybe I just have been, you know, now I'm, you know, what, in this, you know, a good 15 years, and I have written a lot about that. I've, you know, discussed it a lot of years, and I just at the point that, like, they're gonna do what they're gonna do, and to me the question is I feel like as long as you know, I don't feel particularly like kind of like directly sort of challenged by some of whatever their sort of, you know, political frames are, things that they put out in the world. Some things that they put out, you know, are problematic, or positions that they take. That's fine. But I just, at this point, they are who they are, and I think that a lot of the kind of equality organizations are frankly struggling for an identity because, you know, marriage equality is about to happen. They don't know. A lot of them are trying to figure out their future, and, you know, let them figure out their future, and I'm not going to help them. So that's kind of where I am with that.
All right. Thank you. Did you want to weigh?
No, that was good.
Wow.
All right. So I have another question, and this question is, how are we addressing lack of healthcare access in our work?
I think the question I ask myself every single day is, how am I building power among Black, gay, and bisexual men? And to me, these questions on access are irrelevant if there isn't a community, an empowered community that can really fight to save their lives. I mean, I don't assume that these bureaucracies and institutions, healthcare institutions, that they're gonna really value the lives of Black and bisexual men unless we hold them accountable. And if we don't have a network, if we don't have a community of folks present to hold them accountable, I just don't think it's gonna happen. So for me, my question every day is, how are my efforts, how is what I'm doing building power so that stuff can happen?
I mean, I guess I would agree, and I would also say that I think that you know, on some level, there's that, and I think that, like, if we don't also, especially, I think that you have sometimes, it's like kind of organizing or whatever. Sometimes you have a moment, right, where, you know, you get in or you don't, right, and just based on, like, a range of opportunities that exist. That's half of organizing, is knowing, kind of having a sense of, you know, kind of where you can kind of try to move some stuff. And I think that right, building power to kind of change or challenge, like, you know, kind of institutions is, like, primary and important. And I think that work has to also, like, sometimes it takes a few people to be doing that while you sort of build to get people on board. And that, like, it is important to also think about, like, sometimes you don't know until like, people who won't necessarily be connected to the organizing still have to engage those institutions. Like, people still have to go to and deal with whatever kind of healthcare institution, you know, before I or any of us may ever come into contact with them, right? So I think it's, like, both, like, building the power, but also kind of knowing how, like being also continually engaged as you build the power to sort of try to sort of make the institutions responsive, so that people, whether they come into contact with you, have some kind of connect, are able to sort of get what they need, right, in certain kinds of ways. So I think about it as both, like you had to do both at the same time on some level.
Excellent. I have another question. I want to make sure I'm saying this question correctly, so whoever submitted, I apologize for reading it. How is the way that we talk about HIV a part of the problem? For example, we need to end racism in the class, in the media or in a different disease. Like, how is the way we're talking about racism and how is the way we talk about HIV and AIDS impacting our ability to, I suppose, impact the epidemic? So what I'm sensing from the question is that they're asking, when we talk about HIV and AIDS, we always talk about like we must end racism and structural and inequality, et cetera, et cetera. But when we talk about other kind of public health kind of situations, we don't always necessarily go to that space. And so, like for instance, I guess with the clap, which I'm assuming is gonorrhea, chlamydia, like we don't talk about we have to end racism before we can end chlamydia or something like that. We talk about HIV in a particular kind of way, which is I'm assuming that's what the context of the question is asking. Any responses to takers for that one?
Yeah, I'd offer that I think that one contribution that HIV has made to movements among many is that we begin to really think about some of these social determinants that diabetes have talked about, right? Cancers are exploring as well. And because there's a web of oppression, particularly for Black gay men living in this country and people of color, it's just not just one thing. It is a myriad of things, and one just happens to be HIV, may happen to be HIV positive, but that person more than likely may also be living in poverty, abject poverty at that, may also be living with all sorts of other environmental instabilities. And I think that it is important to call those things out. I mean, and I kind of hear this a little bit back to the first question and thinking about some of these larger equality organizations, because there is something to be asked of these institutions who have lots of money and wield lots of influence about the way in which they see Black gay men in particular as a part of their acronym, which we so kind of flippantly throw out in terms of LGBTQ. And the problem with that acronym is that it removes race from the conversation, it removes class from the conversation, and so it throws people into an acronym, and we never have to really address the nuances of the particular communities that actually make up that acronym. And I mean, are we addressing, racism by doing HIV work? I think we are. I think it shows itself up in how we critique power, right? It shows itself up in how we think about, this endemics impacting Black gay men and Black gay men in particular. But we also, I think, are really pushing people in positions of power to really think about reimagining how they see themselves, particularly our white brothers and sisters who are engaged in the struggle for civil rights for LGBTQ folk, but HIV, particularly as it relates to Black gay men, seems to be the locus by which we locate everything that matters in their lives. So we don't really talk about economic empowerment, we don't talk about job security, we don't talk about, educational empowerment in terms of pipelines being created, or even leadership development pipelines that are being created and sustained, outside of just nonprofit work, but also for-profit interests as well. And so we address it in ways that I think that HIV and racism kind of play off each other, and they're addressed very, very interestingly. But I think HIV has kind of expanded the conversation in terms of racism that we had not seen, or at least I have not read in some of the other movement work, which I know exists.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah, I just
another question from the crowd. This one is: how do we as youth help those men that are honest with their women partners until issue is dealt with, continue to manifest? That is the question of
Charles, you want to take that one? All right. Okay, fine. So here's the deal. The issue is not about the HIV epidemic in the Black community is not about bisexual men. So to the person asking the question, I would just be very blunt and say, disabuse yourself of that kind of rhetoric, because it's actually not true. Right? I do think that we have some issues around sexuality in the Black community, and I think the question might be why do we think that so people being able to be open and honest about their sexuality. If you feel like that there's not a space for that bisexual men aren't honest, then the question has become, so what are the conditions that have made them have to sort of be dishonest, right? I think is a question to be asked that I don't think is their problem, right, or their issue in that respect. And I would say that I don't necessarily think that when we're talking about the scale of the epidemic in the black community, that like bisexual men coming out is going to, like, you know, actually have, I think, much of an impact on you know, reduction in HIV rates, certainly among black gay men, right? And some of the research that's been done has actually shown it's actually out black gay men who actually disproportionately have more HIV and who have more sort of quote unquote risk factors where they exist, right? So I think I would push to really challenge a lot of the myths that people have kind of heard about men on the DL or bisexual men over the last, you know, 10 or 12 years, and their resources to do that. And but I think the question maybe is why, you know, what are the conditions that would need to happen in order for people to be able to be honest and whole about their sexualities, period?
Excellent response. With another question. When are we, as black men, going to hold ourselves accountable, other agents accountable to our lives, set when our needs that organization?
Yo, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Okay, I'm going to repeat it one more time. When are we, as black gay men, going to hold ourselves accountable and stop trying to hold accountable for our lives and instead when our needs are not met in the organization?
Well, I think that the challenge is to go recognize and work against the structures that maintain our oppression, and at the same time be absolutely focused on building power in our community, strengthening our institutions, and institutionalizing our movement. I don't think they're oppositional. I think accountability conversation sometimes can have the unintended consequence of stigmatizing the community you're from, like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get your stuff together, and that kind of thing. And so the conversation I'm far more interested in having is, you know, again, recognizing the structural violence that we endure as black gay men have to triumph against, but at the same time, you know, looking, and I don't think it's about accountability per se. I think it's more just about being able to imagine how we want our communities to move forward. You know, being able to think about and be strategic about how we want to advance our agenda. But I also think that when you have a boot on your neck, when you're constantly having to navigate, you know, all kinds of structural violence, it's sometimes difficult to step back out of the sense of urgency. It's difficult to step back out of a sense of crisis and be able to imagine other possibilities other than the microaggressions that you have to encounter daily. But I do think that's work that we have to do.
Excellent response. I have another question. What are we doing to challenge the CDC to fund interventions that effectively address social determinants of health?
Well, they would say that they do that, right?
I'm reporting the questions. Yes.
I mean, I think that I'm interested in having a larger conversation about how we want to engage federal bureaucracies in general. I want to engage the NIMH about why there isn't some kind of more research around trauma in black and bisexual men. I want to engage the National Endowment for the Humanities and why there aren't more resources available to uplift the legacies of Marlon Riggs. Like, I want to be able to get funded to do tongues and thought screenings from the NEH. I would love to see collaborations between the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the CDC. Like, I really feel like the conversation is not so much I think we're just too fixated on the CDC. Not to say we shouldn't have, you know, be looking at them, right? But I also think there are a lot of different federal agencies that they all could be doing. The National the Department of Education, right? All these federal bureaucracies, and even state bureaucracies. And I think that conversation needs to be had about how we want to engage them in general and what they all should be doing.
All right. So we had a lot of great responses, a lot of great questions. I want to thank everyone for tweeting and sending their questions in. We actually have to begin to wrap up. Before we wrap up, though, I do want to offer like maybe 30 seconds for everyone to kind of give us a summary of what they want to send and what core message you want to communicate around this particular topic when we're thinking about Marlon's work, but also thinking about all the topics that we've addressed today, which are surmountable. But I just want to give everybody like 30 seconds to kind of like do a wrap up. What are final thoughts? And let's start with Charles.
Lee Daniels is wrong about homophobia in the Black community. I think that it's dangerous to have this notion that Black communities are more homophobic than other communities, and that also I think doesn't get at the complexity of the ways that Black communities engage sexual diversity, and it also at the same time lets white communities off the hook for the racism that they have perpetuated against Black communities in a way that many white LGBT organizations have felt Black and bisexual men.
And as the kids would say, boom. All right.
Yeah, I would say that I think it's kind of related to the last question the person asked, is that I think that, as Charles said, we have to think beyond the CDC as the sole kind of even just federal agency that is, you know, there's a whole range of agencies that are kind of should be responsive to Black gay men, even ones that are out of the healthcare frame. And I think that one of the questions that I'm interested in us pursuing, and a lot of us kind of geeks who do sort of kind of research activism think about this field called implementation science, right, which is more about like kind of how different like programs or different things work for people where they are, right, and so to me I'm interested in like if we're talking about HIV/AIDS and about a healthcare infrastructure, what will work for Black gay men in Houston versus Atlanta versus, or what are the infrastructures that actually work for them? And I think those are the research questions and the questions that we need to be asking and pushing as a community and help to sort of build those models versus, you know, just kind of always looking at the CDC data every time and just saying, damn, it's bad, and kind of and just challenging the CDC. I'm really interested in like asking and engaging folks around what would work for them and how do we help push to build it.
All right, excellent. At least Aquarius. Aquarius, think you have. Check and see if you move.
Yeah, he's muted. I muted him, I think.
He doesn't. How do you? Aquarius, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So I think about Christian story about Nicodemus, like the teacher of Jesus, right? And Jesus tells him like he must be born again. And I think for those engaged in this work, that we have to, in many ways, be born again. Our minds must be transformed like daily, such that we don't talk about racial justice like in these really abstract terms, but that we become intentional about how we think about what does that mean for our organizations, what does that mean for the work, what does it mean for the sustainability of the work, what does it mean, you know, for us to acquire power, to have access to power. And then if we have access to power and privileges that, you know, we didn't choose, right? We were kind of born into, then how do we, you know, use that access to power and privilege to really help Black gay men in meaningful ways, you know, in really substantial ways, in ways that gives us access, to rooms and to tables such that we may be able to speak our truths and hear us. And also thinking, you know, I think that in this work that somehow creativity has been washed out and done away with. And I think we need to make room for creativity and innovation again. I love science and research. I think that's phenomenal. But I think that when we take out creativity from the human imagination and we remove imagination from our experience, particularly in doing this work, we begin to do the same things over and over and over and over again. And so you think about hearing, you know, what Kenyon is saying about, you know, modifying and really thinking, you know, Atlanta may be different from Houston, and how, and if so how, and how do we make the programming effective in Houston such that it might yield some results that we're seeing in Atlanta. You know, creativity is, I think, is the name of the game. You know, when you remove creativity from the solution or from the equation, the solution becomes the same old, doing the same thing, expecting different results, and we're asking ourselves the same questions as to why are Black gay men experiencing such disproportionate rates of HIV? Are we not doing enough? And the question might be, Have we closed the box of possibilities that exist for this community? And if so, then how do we open it again such that we might begin to see this thing afresh, and that we might ourselves might be transformed throughout the process of creating a new paradigm for Black gay men?
Mhm. Thank you so much, Aquarius. All right, we are out of time. I want to thank all the gentlemen, Kenyon, Charles, Aquarius, for joining us today. It's been a really dynamic conversation. And of course, the conversation continues online. You can follow us on Twitter at Age United. You also can use the hashtag We Shall Not Be Removed to engage our participants, as well as ourselves in this conversation. Like I said, it does not end here. We also will be having future Google Hangouts, which you can learn more about by following us at Age United and liking us on Facebook. Our next one we scheduled is to talk. A topic is love, sex, trust, and intimacy in the era of HIV. And so it'll be a very dynamic conversation centered on community realities for us as Black gay men, and also much more. I want to thank you all once again for participating. Thank you all for joining, and keep in touch.